Neoliberal ends justify the means test, disability and the benefits of poverty management in Canada. My name is Stefan Sunandan Honisch, and I'm joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation, on which the University of British Columbia's Vancouver campus is situated. I would like to begin by thanking Disability Without Poverty for the opportunity to speak with you today. Colin Bruce Anthis, Chelsea Gao, and Amanda Lockitch have provided valuable insights on topics and problems, both adjacent and central to my specific concerns in this lecture. To Walter Ben Michael's pointed question for apologists of neoliberalism, quote, why should we prefer justifying inequality to eliminating it, close quote, Canada answers by intensifying its whole of government commitment to managing poverty and justifying inequality. To rework George Orwell's well-known formulation for this state of affairs, everyone should be unequal, but some should be more unequal than others. Neoliberal ends, it seems, justify the means test. Touted by the champions of, quote, fairness and efficiency, unquote, which is to say austerity, the means test subjects its beneficiaries to what George Orwell describes in his 1937 book, The Road to Wigan Pier, as, quote, a disgusting public wrangle about the minimum weekly sum on which a human being can keep alive, close quote. Yet variants of this, quoting George Orwell, disgusting public wrangle are endemic in neoliberal welfare states, including in Canada. The federal government's Canada Disability Benefit provides an egregious case study in means-tested poverty management under the banner of personal empowerment and exemplifies the failure of liberalism. Here I'm quoting from Martha Russell's 2019 collection of essays on capitalism and disability. Equality and liberation are unattainable within a rights-based disability politics because capitalist exploitation and oppression arise in the economic rather than in the political sphere. And because means-tested welfare programs reinforce capitalism's long-term stability. And so they can do nothing to actually tackle inequality. Moreover, the focus of neoliberal rights discourse on anti-discrimination, positioning diversity, inclusion, and sometimes accessibility as standalone goals, rationalizes the inhuman calculations which means-tested programs require, instead apportioning poverty and wealth in demographically accurate and merit-based ways. The disability justice principles of anti-capitalist politics, collective access, and collective liberation hold promise as an alternative discourse. To the extent that intersectional analysis, quote, can absorb class into the neoliberal theory of inequality, however, as Walter Ben Michael points out, disability justice faces the difficult task in the face of global injustice of struggling towards wealth redistribution and poverty eradication in the existential fight for the public good. A recent New York Times Magazine article about Canada's medical assistance in dying program succeeds where much journalistic coverage fails, namely in drawing attention to the serious ethical issues that confront people who apply for MAID, as it's known by the acronym MAID, and the medical professionals who assess individual applications based on the program's existing criteria. The article discusses the extreme poverty which pushes many people to find a way out of their suffering and isolation. Holding a mirror up to Canada's federal policy environment, it shows the extent to which governments, like corporations, prioritize money over people's lives. Quoting from the article, a report released by the Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated that Bill C-7 would save the provincial governments an estimated $149 million annually in net healthcare costs, close quote. Tellingly, however, the public is on to what this country's ruling classes are up to. Again, quoting from the article in the New York Times, quote, by February 2023, a poll by the Angus Reid Institute showed that more than half of Canadians, 55%, say they worry about medical assistance in dying taking the place of improvements in social services, close quote. What brought us to this catastrophic point, and what is the way away from means-tested catastrophe and towards a future worth its name? Even a short history of the dehumanizing policy choices that have brought us here is well beyond this paper's scope. My chosen method is instead to recapitulate questions that capitalism's latter-day critics have asked for years. These questions taken together encompass the globality of our present predicament. If a basic definition of capitalism places emphasis on its private ownership of the means of production, then a basic conception of the welfare state that, among other things, secures capital's own long-term welfare, a point emphasized by both Margot E. Salomon and Vivek Tibber, should underscore its managerial ownership of the means of means testing. In his preface to James Burnham's 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution, Michael Young, who himself is the author of The Rise of the Meritocracy from 1958, summarizes the basic premise of Burnham's book thus, quote, "Capitalism will be overthrown not so much by the proletariat as by the new class of managers who will gradually, in one country after another, gain control over the state and the instruments of production," close quote. It is worth recalling that Burnham's work inspired George Orwell's own vision of the quote-unquote hellish places. I'm quoting from his 1944 essay, As I Please, to which the managerial class might guide us with superb efficiency. To the question of disability access, the answer is too often still an unadorned no. From this answer, a predictable question follows. Why? When this question is not simply ignored, a host of responses and evasions follow, each in their turn. Especially popular among the latter are heart-rending appeals to some metaphysical budget and its necessary limits. Cost comes before care with great predictability. In Canada, the managerial imperative goes by many names: transparency, accountability, and fiscal responsibility. Even as disability access remains deniable, what Walter Ben Michaels frames as, quote-unquote, equality of access to markets is an undeniable priority, no matter the flavor of neoliberalism a given ruling party happens to dole out within a given election cycle. The deep connection between the denial of disability access as a measure of fiscal responsibility and the consequent inequality of opportunity for disabled people to participate in the life of our communities is driven home by Inclusion Canada. Quote, "The most common response to the employment needs of people with an intellectual disability is placement in a quote-unquote sheltered workshop or day program where people are typically paid only a small weekly stipend of about $5 to $10, if anything at all. This results in exclusion from meaningful paid employment in the community, leaving most Canadians with an intellectual disability unemployed or significantly underemployed. The dedication of Canada's ruling classes to capital needs and market access stands in marked contrast to the mundane concerns of grassroots organizations such as People First of Canada with human needs and disability access. The contrast is instructive. Consider, for example, People First of Canada's stated commitment to, quote, making sure people with intellectual disabilities have real work for real pay and that wages and benefits are the same as those of people without disabilities, close quote. Canada's provincial and federal governments have, for decades, transcended their real or imagined ideological differences to find common ground in a larger cause, undertaking a multi-front onslaught against the public good, using the economic foundations of capitalism, which generate poverty, to design and implement concrete policies which manage poverty. The consequences for the public are a cost of living crisis that has transformed housing, medical care, food, and clothing into luxury goods. Walter Ben Michaels provides a helpful starting point for understanding neoliberals' history in his 2015 book, The Beauty of a Social Problem, Photography, Autonomy, Economy. I quoted earlier from this book. Quote, in Canada at the beginning of 1982, the unemployment rate was 8.6%. By the end of the year, it was 13.1%. In 2025, The unemployment rate is 7%. Given the meanness of Canada's local, provincial, and federal policies, and given capitalism's seemingly unshakable grip on public life, nothing less than universalism will suffice in answering the question of access with a generous, solidaristic yes. Neoliberal ends, which naturally begin in fiscal responsibility, justify a means-tested approach to access to nominally public goods and services, a deeply ethical approach I characterize as poverty management. To begin naturally with fiscal responsibility is to end unnaturally in misery. Orwell's withering analysis of the means test, cited earlier for its emphasis on the minimum weekly sum that the state should spend to keep someone alive, bears an instructive parallel to a passage concerning the minimum wage in the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Quote, "The average price of labor is the minimum wage, i.e. that quantum of the means of subsistence, which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence," close quote. There are two obvious alternatives to medical assistance in dying, becoming the desperate means of escape from the economic suffering documented in the New York Times article cited earlier. Both alternatives are implicit in a series of questions that Martha Russell posed years ago in her aptly titled Dollars and Death. Russell asks, is it humanistic to assist people to a premature death when they suffer ugly economic circumstances and social conditions and need help from society to get through a difficult time? Isn't it humanistic rather to fight for resources and social justice and to avoid death as the social solution? Question mark, close quote. The first alternative would be for policymakers to end all means-tested social services, returning to whatever commitment to universal programs federal, provincial, and territorial governments in Canada may once have had or pretended to have. The second way out lies along an arduous path of collective struggle for those who are exploited by capitalism and those who are not, but who also suffered the results of its commodification of life, to come together around shared interests, not only the specific ones of workers, such as improvements to working conditions, a living wage, paid parental leave, but also more ambitiously around the universal programs in housing, medical care, food, and education that would benefit workers and the unemployed alike, by definition transcending the social hierarchies that the political economy of the social hierarchies that the political economy of capitalism mobilizes to such profitable and devastating effect. That managing poverty in Canada has long required a whole-of-government approach is illustrated in Sherry Toryman's 1996 parenthetical observation regarding the Canada Pension Plan, namely that the maximum payment allowed is actually lower than most provincial welfare rates, and welfare itself falls well below the poverty line throughout the country, close quote. Canada's welfare system is, in short, a poverty trap, carefully crafted and expertly managed. Here I quote from a 2023 Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives report by Kendall David and Megan Linton. Quote, policy, both federal and provincial, forces most people with disabilities in Canada to live in chronic abject poverty, close quote. Equity, diversity, and inclusion statements and policies under the sign of anti-discrimination will not solve economic inequality. Its benefits too often merely trickle sideways to elites within marginalized groups, as sociologist Vivek Chibber has intentionally observed. There's a more fundamental problem with anti-discrimination noted by Walter Ben Michaels, who points out that its aim is, quote, not to eliminate or even mitigate the gap between the rich and the poor, but to justify it, to make sure that the rich deserve their wealth and the poor deserve their poverty, close quote. Justifying poverty and wealth as the diverse results, respectively, of so-called good and bad choices, neoliberalism's favorite menu, depends significantly on a convenient misreading of Michael Young's neologism, meritocracy, which I alluded to earlier, a misreading shared by apologists for neoliberalism across the ever narrower ideological spectrum. The anti-capitalism politics and solidaristic energy of disability justice have not gone far enough beyond what Karl Marx impatiently terms, quote, the narrow horizon of bourgeois right in his critique of the Gotha program. Its constraints remain a barrier to the universalist aims of disability justice in striving towards collective liberation for all. Canada's approach to social services inverts Marx's formulation, also in his critique of the Gotha program, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Rushing to the aid of capitalism's winners, our revised and updated version runs approximately thus. From each according to their disability to each according to a needs test, means test, or income test. Although I cannot pursue this in detail here, the preface to a 2015 special issue of Canadian Journal of Disability Studies questions Marx's pithy formulation cited earlier from his critique of the Gotha program, but in so doing, raises questions of its own. Bonita Heath asks, quote, would an economy based on Marx's ethos be an ideal approach to social inclusion that could end disability poverty? Heath further wonders if Marxian philosophy could, quote, undermine our aspirations for equality and dignity, close quote. These questions, however, conflate the neoliberal goal of equity, which is perfectly compatible with inequality and perfectly at ease with managing poverty, with the socialist and in the case of Marx's critique of the Gotha program, the communist one of reducing and ultimately ending poverty. Heath's forward also carefully, however, Heath's forward also, however, carefully notes internal debates among disability studies scholars about the difference between exclusion and exploitation. Although a clear distinction between class as a material relationship and social identities as discursive categories, what Adolf Reed, among others, refers to as ideologies of descriptive difference, would place this account on firmer ground. The difference between the minimum wage for laborers and the Canada Disability Benefit meted out to its beneficiaries is that the latter, $200 per month plus provincial clawback, is well below the, quote, absolutely requisite to live in poverty. In this respect, it is very much of a piece with the total compensation available to disabled workers in the so-called sheltered workshops that I discussed earlier. A word about clawbacks. These have their origins, naturally, in the splendid accelerating neoliberalism of the 1980s. Here, once again, it is worth recalling an essential part of the meritocratic society satirized by Michael Young in 1958, namely, quote, an elite who knew that to make the country rich, the citizens had to be kept poor, close quote. Although I have taken Young's irony out of context, this passage refers to mid-19th century Russia. The obsession with productivity and the connected indifference to public welfare that he castigates remains applicable to our time. It seems clear that Canada's decades-long policy approaches work against the anti-capitalism and collective liberation goals of disability justice. The Canada Disability Benefit represents merely the most recent iteration of this country's pro-capitalism and anti-liberation ideals. Think of Michael Young's bitter dictum, quote, increases in productivity must be spent on increasing productivity still further and not frittered away on ordinary people, close quote. A Maytree report from quoted in the Globe and Mail in July 2024 notes, while the Canada Disability Benefit would deliver only a modest financial boost for eligible welfare recipients, clawbacks could save the provinces up to hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Once again, money over people. Quote, Ottawa's disability benefit risks helping provincial coffers more than low-income Canadians, critics say, quoting from the same article. The overwhelming majority of Canadian households that rely on social assistance are living in poverty owing to insufficient payments, and the situation is worsening in many provinces because of the inflation crisis. we continue to fail people in Canada who are living on incomes from social assistance. The Canadian Labour Congress has also issued a public statement illustrating the kind of solidarity often missing from our public policy environment. The Canada Disability Benefit is, in the words of the organization's president, Bia Bruske, quote, completely unsustainable. None of the provincial or territorial disability support payment programs lift their recipients above the poverty line, close quote. In Canada, there's a tripart distinction between income-tested, means-tested, and needs-tested programs. Whatever their fine distinctions, bureaucratically tested, of course, these methods of quote-unquote delivery accept poverty as a fact of life, finding increasingly sophisticated ways to manage those whose claims to dignity and equality the ruling elites, ably supported by the professional managerial classes, deem ineligible. Sherry Toriwan notes matter-of-factly that, quote, and this is back in 1996, that, quote, there are no longer any federal income programs delivered on a universal basis. This was in 1996. That's worth emphasizing. But nearly 3 decades into the end of universalism, inequality has made remarkable progress, becoming ever more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. And capital's gains have been further stabilized by the growth of welfare, as noted by sociologist Vivek Chibber in his 2022 book, Class Matrix, Social Theory After the Cultural Turn. Quote, precisely because of their greater wealth and their control over productive investment, employers in every capitalist economy were far better positioned than their employees to influence social policy. Hence, effectuating these demands at any significant scale required political leverage, which is why it was not until the modern labor movement got off the ground that the welfare state could emerge across the capitalist world, close quote. This is in part why I reject the disability studies critique of so-called interest convergence, for example, in architectural or learning frameworks grounded in principles of universal design. The fundamental objection in what's framed as interest conversion is that aspiring to universal access ignores quote unquote systemic discrimination and quote overlooks specific forms of difference. And this is from Jay Dolmage's 2017 book, Academic Ableism, Disability in Higher Education. But such convergence is the unavoidable starting point of solidarity and collective action. The Canadian nonprofit Accessible Housing quotes a statement from the Canadian Human Rights Commission concerning this country's medical assistance in dying program, which I discussed earlier. Quote, accessing medical assistance in dying should not result from systemic inequality, nor should it be a default for a state's failure to fulfill its human rights obligations. With a liberal dose of pessimism, Arundhati Roy writes that, quote, whatever they say during elections or when they're in the opposition, no state or national government and no political party, right, left, center, or sideways, has managed to stay the hand of neoliberalism, close quote. It is almost too easy, indeed it is too easy, to find examples of the absurdity and cruelty of Canada's means-tested welfare state. A CBC News article notes that so-called middle-income renters and those trying to survive on pensions make a little bit too much to qualify for subsidized housing, close quote. The unavailability of public housing sits atop a grounding problem in more than one sense. As Colin Bruce Antis points out in an article on the land crisis for Canadian Dimension, land value is socially created and when privately extracted by rentier landlords, leads to problems that are systemic, vicious, and circular. And later, while we might be able to make some improvements here and there through clever initiatives, we almost certainly cannot solve the housing crisis without dealing directly with the land question. The emphasis is in the original. It may very well be that Michael Denning is right to observe that, quote, the only thing worse than being exploited is not being exploited under capitalism. That's from his 2010 article, Wageless Life in the New Left Review. Martha Russell warned as long ago as 1998 that, quote, the market society that glorifies efficiency and profit above principles of cooperation and equality has brought our civilization to an inhumane abyss, close quote. The better part of 3 decades later, Russell's warning seems the more prescient, given the now existential danger of profitable catastrophes. It may be that Canada's acceptance of economic inequality as a problem to be managed through austerity policies rather than one to be solved through universal programs will wash us all down. Certainly, absent wholesale transformation as opposed to retail reformation, truly equitable, truly inclusive, truly diverse workplaces, schools, universities, and communities operating according to egalitarian principles are difficult, if not impossible, to imagine. Workers are faced with unemployment, a reality that the political classes distort for their own ends, denying the idea of class itself through rhetorical tricks such as bad choices and the precariat. This is from a footnote in Walter Ben Michael's 2015 book, The Beauty of a Social Problem. In June 2025, the BC government put its elbows up, increasing the provincial minimum wage by 45 cents. Rolf Hosfeld traces Marx and Engels' prediction that the instability of bourgeois society would foment radicalism to the, quote, prognosis of the inevitable immiseration of the worker in the modern world of capital, close quote. In our own time, as in theirs, of course, it is not only the worker who, quote, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class and becomes a pauper, close quote. It is also anyone who needs social assistance and any form of home and community-based support. The BC government has a page on what it calls home support, which specifies the following. Clients, not the business terminology, must agree, quote, to pay the assessed client rate. A main feature of the complicated rules and procedures that, quote, clients face in the struggle to obtain home support is what one might describe as advanced mathematics. Quote, a client's out-of-pocket payment or daily rate is calculated by multiplying the remaining annual income as defined in the continuing care fees by 0.0001388889, close quote. To emphasize, I'm quoting directly from the BC government website. Presumably to avoid the cost of home support becoming prohibitive for quote-unquote clients, the BC provincial government limits the total out-of-pocket costs to $300 per month. Although the BC government website provides instructions for how to apply for something called a reduced rate, its incoherent definition of, quote, serious financial hardship, close quote, makes clear the basic problem with income means and needs testing. By setting the eligibility bar prohibitively high, requiring clients to somehow perform, being unable to pay for basic needs for adequate food, sufficient home heat, housing, and prescription medications, provincial government policy, like that of the federal government, wrests equality, autonomy, and dignity away from quote-unquote clients in need, instead granting itself control over what we need and hiding behind conveniently empty adjectives, adequate and sufficient. It bears emphasis that the services carefully measured out in deference to these policy frameworks are wholly inadequate and altogether insufficient. This is what I mean by characterizing Canada's social services as emblematic of poverty management. Medical equipment, maintenance, and repairs are not covered by Canada's nominally public healthcare system. Martha Russell, whom I quoted at the beginning of my talk, warned as long ago as 1998 that the market society, just to repeat that passage, that glorifies efficiency and profit above principles of cooperation and equality has brought our civilization to an inhumane abyss. The better part of 3 decades later, Russell's warning seems the more prescient, given the existential threats of the unfolding climate crisis and the ever-present danger of global warfare, both of which, in the words of Noam Chomsky, could, without collective resolute action, bring, quote, organized human existence to an ignominious end. That's from a talk that he gave for the University of Victoria. I would like to conclude my talk in a mood of what philosopher Mara van der Lucht calls hopeful pessimism. My remarks on disability and inequality may suggest that politics has become the art of the impossible. Think back to Walter Ben Michael's still unanswered question Why should we prefer justifying inequality to eliminating it? The Canada Disability Benefit expresses a general preference among policymakers for at least managing, if not justifying, inequality. We witnessed something of the sort during the COVID-19 pandemic, with disabled people effectively punished for taking on additional jobs to support the monthly, quote, disability assistance, itself well below BC poverty line, as noted in a December 2020 report on the CBC News website. Citing Terry Eagleton's observation that, quote, optimism is a typical component of ruling class ideologies, Mara van der Lucht asks us to attend to and to move in rhythm with, quote, the hope that stands beside the hope that stands beside pessimism and walks hand in hand even with despair, the hope that is born of sheer uncertainty, the hope of hopeful pessimism. That's the title of her book. At the outset, and just a few minutes ago, I referred to the globality of our predicament. I would like to leave you with the cautionary notes sounded by Arundhati Roy from 2009 in the introductory essay, Democracy's Failing Light, for her book, Field Notes on Democracy, Listening to Grasshoppers. Arundhati Roy notes, quote, justice has come to mean human rights, and of those, as they say, a few will do. Roy reminds us of the immiserating limits of rights-based claims. In the essay's closing pages, she recalls a couplet by the socialist and poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, helpfully including both the original text and her own translation. First in Urdu, "E nahi nigah mein manzil to justaju hi sahi. E nahi visal mayasar to arzu hi sahi." And Roy's translation into English, if dreams are thwarted, then yearning must take their place. If reunion is impossible, then longing must take its place. I would say if universal programs are thwarted, I would ask rather, if universal programs are thwarted, then must means-tested neoliberalism take their place? Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.